Hello, everyone. We are back once again with another episode of the Young and Foolish podcast. And this week, we're going to talk about something that I have personally wanted to talk about for quite a while. I guess just never, haven't really gone around to until now. And this is a topic that is definitely relevant to why I suggested that our name should be Young and Foolish podcast. It has to do with the foolish part. So the topic this week is really knowledge, and there's really three things I want to talk about. And the first thing is the most directly related to why our podcast is called Young and Foolish podcast. And this also makes sense to us to talk about this week because Lorenzo and I recently went to Indigo Books. And we talked about this a little bit, just kind of brought it up in passing. But the first idea here in this topic that I want to talk about is kind of how, the idea when people say that the wise man knows himself to be a fool. And really, I'm going to kind of expand on that, kind of declare my thesis almost, is that the more you know, the more you realize just how little it is that you really know. That is really the idea that I want to talk about. So to start off, I guess what I want to say here is that in any particular area, when you're really learning a lot about it and you understand more and more, you accumulate more and more knowledge, you really do understand just how much more there is for you to know. And in many fields, when you're at the frontier, you're really doing research. You're literally trying to fill in the gaps in knowledge. You're really trying to uncover new information to add onto our cumulative knowledge as humans, really, as a society, right? So you really understand just how much more there is to still figure out, right? And then at the same time, if you're kind of at a very advanced and very elite level in any specific field, you also understand, you gain the perspective about how if I know this much and there's still so much to know about this, then I must know absolutely nothing essentially about other fields. You really get that idea. Hey, how, like I really just don't know that much overall. If there's so much I still don't know about the field I'm already so advanced in, right? So when it comes to other fields, I really must have a pretty relatively elementary level of understanding of overall knowledge. So that is the main idea, the main concept I'm trying to talk about here. So what are your thoughts on that?
I think it's 100% facts, 100%. The story, it's a really ancient kind of idea. The story goes that the Oracle of Delphi told Socrates that he was the wisest man in the land. It's pretty neat, but then he himself thought himself to be a fool. And he was, I think, one of the first ones that said, the wise man knows himself to be a fool and all that jazz, which, that's kind of the idea that got this ball rolling, right, with us. I think that's a very powerful insight because the world it's incredibly complicated, and I think very few fields are, I guess, entirely known to us. You know what I mean? There's very few fields of knowledge that we've completely and totally explored and completely exhausted. I think it's very narrow. I think there's a lot of reasons for that. I think there's so many things are connected, right? Like in academia, for example, history and like politics, even science and philosophy, all those things are so connected. If you go back far enough, Aristotle and Plato and all those people and Socrates were the people who first started it, right? In politics, if you go back far enough, some of the first big writings in Western culture were done by those ancient philosophers. The first look into science, the natural philosophy. Those guys started it all, right? And in a way, so many different things are connected. If you look at neuroscience today or psychology today, there's always a big emphasis on looking at things with multiple perspectives at different levels of analysis.
Mm-hmm.
So there's no one way to say, okay, this is what causes behavior, right? Or like, oh, this is how memory works. There's people who look at it from, okay, what's the mechanistic perspective? And they'll establish that, and they'll look like, okay, you see that these neurons work this way, right? And that's how memory comes from. But then you have like a more social level where it'll be like, okay, that's a bad example for memory. But different levels of analysis yield different things. So like you might look at it from evolutionary perspective after that or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And no one way is right or wrong. And as soon as you start looking at different things that way, and you realize that it's not just limited to say something like psychology or neuroscience or something like that. Same idea pops up in many different areas, I think, There's many different ways to evaluate, historical perspectives or historical events. Same thing with social just happenings, I suppose. You can analyze them in many different levels. You can see, oh, okay, this change is happening because of this. And oftentimes it's not even teleological. Sometimes it's just completely just irrational. Society and culture has evolved. So in that way, it's very difficult to gain knowledge about it. So yeah, I think the more you know, I think the less you know. No, well, not the less you know, but the more you know that you don't know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I completely agree with that. 100%. Socrates got it right.
What about you, Raymond? What are you thinking? For those who don't know what's happening, Raymond kind of disconnected. Technical difficulties, I suppose.
Technical difficulties. That Wi-Fi, man, that Wi-Fi is not good. Rough times.
Yeah. But honestly, man, like it's been said in many ways in history by so many different people, right?
I think, yeah, it has been. But that Socrates example is, I think, one of the best ones too, just because of the context that he lived in, right? Because if you think about it, they executed him for corrupting the youth of Athens and whatnot, and I feel like that just had so many layers to it. Now, obviously, like they just thought, like, oh, morally he's bankrupt, right?
Mm-hmm.
He doesn't follow like the old ways, Yeah. He's espousing this kind of like separation from the gods and whatnot, right?
Mm-hmm.
Also, I find it really interesting because, and I've only just started looking into this kind of stuff, but apparently there was like this Sophistry movement back in the day, which was, and again, I haven't looked into it too much, so I haven't seen what any of their, but it sounds more like they were just focused on rhetoric. And in the plays of Aristophanes, the sophists are kind of presented as these people who they sound almost like just professional debaters, and they're just focused on debating so well that they can just beat anybody in an argument, even if they have a really weak argument.
Wow.
But in the one Aristophanes plays that I know of, they accidentally pull in Socrates with them, and he was very much against sophistry. And that just, I think that shows a certain ignorance. Obviously, it was just one play by one person, right?
Yeah.
So that might not be indicative of everybody, but it's just, I feel like the way he ended up dying, kind of illustrates this point a little bit. It shows how ignorant they were, almost. In a way, I understand why they ended up doing it, right? It makes sense from, like, I guess, a certain perspective. It's like, yeah, he is kind of challenging their authority in a way, if you think about it, because he's kind of challenging kind of a lot of parts of their culture, and he was critiquing them a lot, like the upper class Athenians who were actually running stuff. So I mean, yeah, if you go do that back in antiquity, you probably will get executed. But I think it just goes to show he might have been right. There might have been something to it. They were quite foolish in that sense.
Well, Raymond, what do you think?
You know, I think I don't know. There's like, okay, so I was talking to Mitch last night, and for all those who don't know, Mitch is my roommate. He's in business, and he brought up a point. And I don't know. It was a weird conversation. We started off talking about like the fourth dimension, and then we started talking like
Nice.
like how we can't really perceive that or understand that, and then one thing led to another. Like I forgot the points like we were arguing about or debating about, but he said something on the lines of so I thought this was interesting. He said something about basically, back in older days of mathematics. He's in business, by the way, so I don't know. Pretty sure he learned this, but back in the days of old mathematics, people had formulas to let's say for the power of 2, right? If you take the power of 2 of something, they would draw basically shapes for it. And so let's say x to the power of 2 of something. So let's say, the other numbers. So let's say they draw like a square, all right? And each side of the square is based.
Is that
Well, like, so that how they figured out x was basically they figured out the sides. So like they put the sides on each side. They're like, okay, if you add it up together, then it'd be the total, which is x, right, or something like that. And he was saying how basically the one thing that got to them and how that whole system got reworked was when like power 3 came into place, right? And someone was like, oh, like how do we draw that, right? How do we perceive that? so basically when that happened, they were like, okay, some guy figured out, okay, you know what, there's like 3-dimensional shapes we can use, right? So that went on. But then when it came to negatives, they couldn't understand how it's possible to have a negative amount of something. So that really got them thinking. And it's kind of like what you guys were saying earlier, how there's no right, there's not necessarily like a one way formula that's right for everything. Although maybe like that idea worked for whole numbers, when it came to negative numbers, they had to rethink the whole strategy and formula and the way they do it. So I don't know, what I think is there's a vast amount of ways to do something, and it might work in certain scenarios, right? But then when you add different factors or like add more, it might not work for that, and you have to use like a different type of strategy against that, right? So I don't know. I think that's kind of fascinating when you look at all these other different subjects, right? Like this science, like you guys were talking about psychology, neuroscience, and then like you got the whole like mathematical world as well, and so on and so on. And it really shows us, how little we know about things, and how often we change our schools of thoughts just to, I guess, just to, I forgot the word,
further understanding,
I guess. But yeah, like, I don't know. There's a lot to everything, man.
Math is actually a pretty neat example. I like that math example.
Yeah.
But there's so many different, because I feel like, there's kind of this debate of whether or not math is discovered or invented, right? But whichever way it goes, I feel like a lot of examples in math kind of relate to this. Like, for example, the imaginary numbers, right? It's kind of similar to what you're saying, where they had to like first start conceptualizing negative numbers and how that fit into like their formulas and whatnot. Imaginary numbers, that's just like, yo, what if we could take the square root of all these numbers, right? And then they just rolled with it, and then there's a whole bunch of very interesting math that came out of it. And it's like, I mean, I don't know if it's precisely the right way to think about it, but if you got like a number line, the imaginary numbers are perpendicular to it, which like, what? How does that make any sense? It's a number line. How can you have something that's perpendicular to a number line? That makes absolutely no sense. Yeah. So things like that, pretty neat. The development of calculus and statistics and whatnot. All very interesting, but for the longest time we had no idea about it. And I'm sure, probably chances are, people at the forefront of mathematics were aware of the limitations that, like, I wonder if there's some way to work this out from that, right? And maybe they had worked out some of the formulas that were needed for it. I don't know. I haven't looked up for it. I'm sure somebody came to a lot of rudimentary equations. I don't know how accurate they'd be without calculus. Like maybe somebody did end up integrating something or deriving something without knowing calculus per se. Maybe they just worked it out through physical testing. Okay, this is the formula for this and this is the formula for that. Maybe, I don't know. Haven't looked into it. Maybe humans never derived or integrated anything until Newton came around. Who knows? But surely people are aware of the limitations that math had, and that's precisely why Newton went about creating calculus. He wanted a new tool for studying the celestial bodies, And then from there, calculus just went absolutely crazy with everything. Bananas.
But like Newton doing the calculus, trying to basically see it in a different way, right? To kind of go beyond some of the limitation he had at that time is just one of many examples of people really looking for new ideas, new ways of thinking about it, because they understand that the way it is done now, like there are just those limitations that are there, and they really try to do something about it, right? And many times you also see that people kind of fall into a kind of acceptance of the limitations, or that they accept certain dogmas in fields where the evidence at that time may suggest that certain dogmas exist, but you uncover new information, you do new research, and the results might suggest, hey, you know what we always believed to be correct is actually incorrect, and there are more nuance to it, and there are certain things that if we follow this dogma, it just couldn't be explained. So they have to kind of add on to their original theories, or they have to completely start new theories, where they have to work and figure out other theories that tie older theories together to actually explain how things really work. And that's why, like in the field of physics, they work so hard to find the God equation, right? But some of those things, it takes a lot, and what people are working on now could very much be wrong, but nonetheless, they still add to our knowledge, and they still are important part of the process. And it's very important to just kind of know these limitations, and also know that certain things that we believe now could be incorrect, because many very reputable researchers that also like really well cited researchers from back in the day turned out to be incorrect in one way or other. But there were huge leaps for us to really develop our knowledge further, right? It's a great step in the right direction. So honestly, it just takes people to really understand that, hey, there's still just so much that we don't know, And even the stuff we don't know isn't necessarily correct. And having understanding is what allows people to explore different ways of looking at it, like you're saying. And there are almost always many different ways of looking at it that aren't necessarily right or wrong. And for people to actually go ahead and try and do it, well, that's what's going to get us even further. That's what's going to allow us to uncover new information, right? And time and time again, we really see that it is true that the more that people are learning about a certain field, the more they understand just how little that they know about it, and a lot of times how little we as people know about that field overall. Mm-hmm. And to move on to the second kind of idea that I wanted to discuss here for this topic, and that is that everything is really built on fundamentals, right? And when it comes to knowledge in any field, without a strong foundation, you'll basically struggle at the higher levels, at the more advanced stuff. Like there's just no way around it. You gotta understand the fundamental principles. You gotta know everything really well, and to kind of once again state my thesis almost is that I guess it might be easier to use like a analogy almost like in sports, for example. Any sport really, you try to compete at the highest levels, you're not going to be thinking about the fundamentals, how to do the basic techniques. You're not thinking about that way. You're just doing it. It comes very naturally to you. You're thinking about more advanced stuff. You're just kind of being in the flow of things, and you're just performing at your level, right? And it's similarly in academics. When you're really doing research, you're not so much thinking about the fundamental principles because you understand that so well. It's just a part of your reasoning that comes naturally. You don't have to think so hard about it. You don't have to think so hard about how to do certain experiments, certain techniques, because you've done it so many times. You know how it works. You know what the results are supposed to mean, and what kind of different results you could get from it. So when you analyze it, it's also much easier. A lot of these things, when you're at a higher level, you really just need to understand the fundamentals really well, or else you're just going to struggle. And it is really just built upon those foundation blocks, right? So what do you think about that?
Yeah. I think the foundation block example is nice because I just kind of conceptualized it a second ago. It's like, as of knowledge is almost like a tower, you know? That would be very difficult to build a tower if you couldn't see the blocks you were building on, right? Yeah. So to attain like a higher level of knowledge, you know, if you're building off of a weak foundation, that's almost to me as if you don't know what you don't know, right? Like what we just talked about.
Yeah.
Similar concept, you know. It reminds me of a lot of times where like I'll hear of a certain mechanism, or I'll hear of how something works, but I won't truly understand the mechanism, right? And I'll kind of extrapolate from that, right? And then I'll learn about the actual mechanism later, and I'll be like, oh, okay, so like this would work, but then this actually wouldn't work based off of my own conception of it, right? Like for example, just the other day I was reading about the capsaicin receptors. They're not really capsaicin receptors. I forget what they're, the phalanoid receptors. That's what they're called, but I mean, really, they're supposed to just open up in response to changes in temperature. And, you know, capsaicin, for anybody who doesn't know, I'm sure you should know, but that's the thing that you have spicy things, it's kind of spice. So the receptor itself isn't meant to open up in response to any chemical, but it'll open up just because capsaicin just happens to bind to it. But that got me thinking, because I had always kind of thought that if you kept cold water in your mouth, that it should provide a cooling effect, right? Because I had heard somewhere that, capsaicin lowers your sensitivity to heat. And I guess in a way that might be true, but not in the way that I thought it was. Because now I have to look into it more. How does that work? Is it the cooling water activating the other cold receptors that you have in your mouth, and that has like some, what's it called? I guess mediating effect on the signals your brain is getting from the capsaicin receptors, or how else does it work? So now I have to look into it more, man. Because now I really don't know. But point being, until I found out, precisely how it worked, I didn't realize that, like, I had no clue how it worked. You know what I mean? So now I'm in a better position to find out precisely, like, okay, did I just placebo myself for a couple of years? Or is this a legit thing? Can you just keeping cold water in your mouth actually help significantly? Or is that just a placebo? I don't know. But I mean, the same thing can be said for a lot of other fields, you know what I mean? You see a very teleological kind of progression in the sciences, and I don't think that's a particular coincidence, I mean, that's perfect demonstration of this kind of characteristic of knowledge that we're just talking about. And like you mentioned earlier, in the past, looking at many different fields, you have kind of periods, right? You have, for example, in psychology, you had, at the very beginning, you had structuralists that tried to model physics model psychology after physics, which is kind of like the model science of the time. And they were really into reductionism, and kind of trying to break consciousness down to like its basic components. Obviously, we didn't have any of the sophisticated imaging technologies we have nowadays, so they ended up kind of falling by the waysides eventually. But they were the kind of like the beginners of psychology. And even though their ideas by nowadays are just almost completely discarded, right? It's like, okay, the way they went about research, not good, all that jazz. But what we get from them nowadays is kind of like this focus on consciousness. It was kind of put to the wayside for a while because their very dodgy science kind of gave way to eventually things like behaviorism, which completely discarded consciousness. So like, we can't examine the inner workings of the mind. We can only examine overt behavior. But from behaviorism and that doctrine, we learned of a lot of things because they were only interested in looking over behavior. That's where we get like operant conditioning and classical conditioning from. But eventually we had like cognitive psychology that popped up. And then from cognitive psychology, we got so many new tools to examine the brain and consciousness again. And all these different eras gave us kind of like new understandings of things and built upon the last one. And you see this across all the different fields, right? In physics, you had, pre-Newtonian physics, that had some understanding of some things. And then you had classical physics, and now you have things like quantum physics being built upon. And, quantum physics, you can't get to quantum physics if you don't first get to Newtonian physics and figure out what the limitations are there.
Yeah, and the thing is, like, we know that Newtonian physics isn't, correct, right? There are things that just
in certain situations.
But the thing is, like, despite knowing that, we still learn it because it's so useful and it's such an important thing to understand. And it's also like how nowadays all the previous models of like the atom is still taught because a lot of those understandings really capture certain concepts that's very important to understand, where you're getting into how things really works, where we're just more nuanced understanding how it works, not even necessarily how it really works, because in many ways we still don't really understand how a lot of things really works, right? So you really do see the things built on top of each other. And not only that even nowadays, when we know their limitations and what ways that they are incorrect, they are still very useful for our learning, and they act as those foundational blocks. Because when you understand the history of how things kind of build up to it, and you understand those principles behind those previous theories and models, could actually understand the newer, more developed theories and models that are in these different fields. You understand the different approaches that are used nowadays and why they are done and what the benefits are. So it's just such a very useful thing for us to learn those previous things that are wrong. And like I said, and like you said, you really do get a very, very kind of a very, how should I say this, in-depth understanding. Well, not even in-depth, you just get a very clear, you get a very clear understanding just how everything really is built on top of each other in that way, right? And without those blocks, you can't even imagine how you would get to the point that you are at. Like there's just no way, right? Like it's a necessary step, and you understand that when you actually look at it.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm picturing like kind of like a domino effect type of thing. So like, let's say every domino that gets knocked over, right, is like a new something like new being discovered, right, and that leads to the next domino and the next domino. But then the thing is, you don't know when the domino train ends, right? So like it could go on for a while, but thing is you don't really know when it ends. So like it's trying to find the boundaries of that, right? And then let's say that's only for one domino, chain, and then there could be more, and it just never kind of ends, because we don't know where it ends and how it ends. We just know that it kind of like one thing leads to another, and then that leads to new discoveries of something else. It's like when language first arrived, as well as like communication factors, right? We didn't have writing, we didn't have anything that that was permanent at the very beginning, right? Everything was taught orally, everything was kind of transcribed orally as well, until someone was like, all right, you know what, like cavemen, right? Or cavemen, like it's kind of like you find people started doing like pictographs and stuff, and then like later on you kind of like see more and more in depth towards writing down things, because like when you say something, it's not permanent, it's only in the present, and like it's almost like it auto deletes itself, kind of like Snapchat, right? So people are like, you know what, maybe that's not the way to go, and then I think in class I was learning about like how this like ancient Chinese philosopher was saying something like the faintest ink is like more than like the wisest of words, or something like that. I don't know, but it's basically like like it starts off with like speech, and then writing, and then leads on, and then like it leads to others, and everything's interconnected in a way. So like that chain really helps like another chain of things. So yeah, I don't know. I honestly don't know.
Yeah, that insight into writing is huge. I like that you bring that up.
We wouldn't know all of these things of antiquity that we talk about if they weren't written down by someone. A lot of the times they weren't written down by the philosopher themselves. It's not necessarily their own work, right? Like some of them never wrote anything down. They just went around their city, having discussions with other philosophers. They just gone in public events and talked about it. They've taught other people, right? But they never really published their own work in writing, and it was documented by other people, and those are transcribed over and over again in history. And that's how a lot of times stuff actually make it to the modern times. So yeah, absolutely huge. The writing thing that you brought up. What were you gonna say, Lorenzo?
I think it's honestly incredible how much info we do have on these figures. So like, Because think about it, man, written in like old, papyrus scrolls or whatever, and we still know about what they wrote 2,000 years ago. Makes you think what we lost in the burning of the Library of Alexandria, but
Oh yeah, man.
because we know of so many works that have been alluded to and like fragments that we find and whatnot, and we just don't have them. Like, this is an offside real quick. I think, who was it? I forget who it was, but I think it was either Plato or Aristotle that wrote. No, I think it was Aristotle. He wrote. He wasn't just about science. He was also about the humanities as well. Because back in the day, philosophers didn't really make those distinctions that we make nowadays.
It was all just philosophy, like
Yeah,
even
pretty
Pythagoras, the math stuff he was talking about. That was just a part of philosophy as well.
Yeah,
It
yeah.
was just
But he even wrote about poetry and like writing tragedies and comedies
Mhm.
and satirical plays. And his writings on tragic plays have been massively influential. A lot of people have read it over the centuries, and it might not have always been available to the Western world. There was like a long period of time where all of Aristotle's writings were only really accessible in not the Arabian world. I guess, yeah, no. Because they were only available in the Middle East. I suppose.
What's it called? Islamic world.
Yeah, no, it was pre-Islamic though, because it was following the breakup of, oh man, what was it? It wasn't in Latin ever. It was, man, what was it? I can't even remember. But I
Was
think
it Persian?
It wasn't Persian. It wasn't Persian because it was after the conquest of Alexander. But I forget what it was. But basically, it was only accessible in this one language, and then eventually somebody bothered to translate it back into the Greek and Latin, and that's how we know about it.
Yeah.
What was it? I forget what that place is called, but it was like in that Middle East kind of area.
Okay.
But we didn't know about it for the longest time. What was it you saying?
Yeah, no, but like the thing is, a lot of the kind of our knowledge of the ancient world was kind of documented by the Islamic world and was reintroduced into the Western world through kind of their conquest, right, of Southern Europe, and because in the Dark Ages, in the different periods in the Middle Ages, a lot of that was lost. A lot of people were illiterate. A lot of those kind of just historical documents and knowledge was just not accessible to people. They just didn't, have it or are able to actually read it or whatnot. And it wasn't a focus, right? But it was through those, that was basically, those existed in this Islamic world because how influential it was, right? When you talk about ancient Rome and ancient Greece, and then when they being so powerful and having knowledge, having literacy, when they kind of like what's it called, the conquest, right, of Southern Europe, those got reintroduced and those got translated back into Latin and other things and was studied by scholars at least, but later on, especially during the Renaissance, those were studied by a lot more people because literacy was making a comeback, right? So you do definitely see this trend of stuff being lost in one area but is kept in another because of how significant it was. And then it gets reintroduced, it gets translated back into other languages to the other parts of the world. So yeah, that you definitely see that time and time again.
100%. And then just some final thoughts on writing. I have a book that talks about like some of the bigger developments. I think it's like the 100 biggest things that happened in human history, and it'll talk about like the printing press, even just paper as we know it. From wood pulp we couldn't make for the longest time. We used to make it out of rags apparently. and obviously that's not nearly as scalable as making it out of wood. But one of the biggest, I guess, influential ideas is writing, because writing is what enables such quantities of information to be passed down through generations. Back in the day, most of the information, like back in antiquity, most of the information that people would be taught as an education would come from like an oral tradition. Like, for example, the Odyssey and the Iliad, I hear, they weren't just really good stories. They were fundamental in the education of people back then. And Socrates criticized this because he's like, if you look at the actual people in that book, they're not particularly good role models, man. I don't know if we should be educating people with this. And that was one of the things that a lot of people didn't like him for. They're like, what do you mean, man? Come on, it's a classic. That's my interpretation of it, right?
Yeah, it was already a classic.
Yeah.
but it's true though. It kind of was, right? At least for like the area.
Yeah.
So
oftentimes what you see is that like the first things that get written down in a particular place are the epics, I suppose. I was watching a lecture the other day where this historian Michael Sugru, Dr. Michael Sugru, he was talking about the Epic of Gilgamesh, and he was mentioning like epics across all cultures. They serve like an educational purpose, and they contain all of the knowledge. A lot of times they'll talk about creation myths. They'll show kind of like their moral framework as the hero kind of works through it. They'll talk about laws and whatnot. They'll talk about everything about their society, right? It kind of forms almost encyclopedia of their knowledge to that point, right? In a way, I'm sure it didn't have everything, but it held a great deal of their knowledge. And that's one of the first things that gets recorded down. I don't think that's a coincidence, right? That's when people first started recognizing, like, hey, maybe there's something to this writing thing beyond just, regular bookkeeping. Because that's where it first came from in, like, ancient Sumer.
A lot of that was also about kind of creating identity for the nation, right? Creating a culture. It's having something that everyone can relate to and kind of share, right? And like you said, it includes so much of their knowledge, their story, their beliefs, right? Just all these different aspects. So having people know that and kind of buy into it really helps in the creation of a national identity or a regional identity, right? Because they don't necessarily consider themselves nations, right? But that's the idea.
Yeah, it was more like city-states back in the day.
Yeah, exactly.
It's a little interesting. But that's actually a really good point. That reminds me specifically of the Epic of Gilgamesh, because that's such an ancient text that if you read into it, there's a lot of places in there where you can see kind of like affirmations of that city-state lifestyle. Because back then, that's when people were first transitioning over to cities. So the Epic of Gilgamesh was surely oral long before it ever got written down into like the clay tablets that we first found it in fragments, right? So, but there's a lot of elements in there that kind of contrast living inside the city versus outside of the city. And you see, not just in the Epic of Gilgamesh, but like outside of the city is like, well, the crazy shit goes down. Inside the city, you're safe. You know what I mean? Or that's like the place of the gods and whatnot. Outside of the city, you're fucked, man. Not like back then. When you're literally Bronze Age, transitioning from that hunter-gatherer lifestyle into like living in cities with a bunch of people. That's a very powerful message. Nowadays it's like that concept doesn't seem entirely alien to us. It's like, we can. It's very easy to understand that. And when you're first reading something, I feel like it might be so obvious that it can be overlooked. You might not realize the significance of what going outside of the city means at first, in these epics. So I think it's foundational, it was in these epics and whatnot. It was one of the first things that it was one of the first kind of examples of people being like, this whole civilization thing, that's a good idea. It being written down, I think it was more of a consequence afterthought. I think it's just more of a testament to how important it was. If they wrote out their epics first, it's one of the first things every culture ends up writing down. That's kind of like the interesting bit about writing in that respect. But the epics themselves are very interesting in the sense that, like you mentioned, it wasn't even just kind of like their own cultural identity. It was like, yeah, culture is a good thing, bro. Let's go.
Yeah. That was definitely a bit more of a kind of tangent. Almost. It was very natural to get to that point. But the main concept of that kind of segment was that everything is kind of built on fundamentals, right? There are foundational blocks. It's incremental. It's steps, right? So everything is kind of built on that, and you see it in so many different ways. And writing is such an important thing that allows that to kind of happen. But the final idea I want to talk about today on this, topic of knowledge is how knowledge is power. You hear people say it, but I think to me, what that means, like one of the, I guess the most important meaning behind that, and what I want to talk about here, is that knowing certain things and really understanding certain things is oftentimes what drives us to actually do things, to make a change in our lives, right? Like we talked about sleep, we talked about diet, we talked about exercise, and I think really understanding the importance of some of those things and effects of doing certain things a certain way, I think that sometimes is what really allows us to think to ourselves and say, hey, maybe I should really do it, and then we actually take action. I think you could hear other people tell you stuff all the time, but that doesn't necessarily, do anything. It's when you actually have that knowledge, when you really understand it, that it has a meaning to you that actually could get you to make changes in your life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, knowledge can definitely be very empowering.
Yeah, it's an interesting idea.
Yeah,
it's definitely something to think about. Because a lot of time you don't necessarily consciously think about something like this, right? Because a lot of time, once you understand certain things, you gain perspective, right? And we talk about perspective a lot, especially me. But having that knowledge, I think, is what changes the perspective and is what ultimately drives you to make that change.
Yeah, that's definitely true. I mean, the whole, especially that first point we were talking about, right? I think that's one point that you can only ever come to, and I feel like that's a very powerful kind of knowledge to come to. That idea that there's so many different perspectives, right? I forget what the exact wording of the first point was, but that you can only really come to that sort of very powerful insight if you study a lot of the history behind a lot of the knowledge we have nowadays. Like if you look at how we use like the examples, like we only really came to those conclusions by looking at, okay, that's how physics developed, that's how psychology developed, that's how math developed, and we see the progression. And now we have not just a powerful insight into any one of those specific fields, but a very powerful insight into just knowledge in general, being like, okay, you need to look at it from multiple perspectives, right? So that's very powerful just in and of itself. It just gives you new tools as you build upon stuff. Like we mentioned earlier, just builds up. Those, not even just the information itself that we get, but the building blocks that we use to get to that information as we practice with it and we get more adept at using them. That's super powerful. That's massive. I mean, I think the biggest testament to this is, Alexander the Great, he was tutored by Aristotle himself, man, and he took over the entire world. What a god, and he never lost a battle, man. And I mean, a great deal of that was how good the Macedonian army was too, but and just goes to show knowledge is so powerful. And then Sun Tzu, all warfare is based off of deception. Deception is conveying false information to your enemy, right?
Yeah.
So, in a way, war is all just about information information warfare has
Yeah.
always been around. Espionage.
Always.
That's been a thing for forever, literally.
So many different forms of it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, different military technologies, so the knowledge
Yeah.
of doing things like, why didn't other people develop military technologies? It's because they didn't know better. It's
Yeah.
not that the ancient Greeks couldn't make 16-foot long spears if they didn't want to, or if they wanted to. They just decided
Mhm.
not to until the Macedonians got around to it. And then GG
Yeah.
for the entire
Yeah, but
peninsula,
once you
right?
know, but once
Like,
you know, you make
yeah.
the change, right? Like once you understand that it's based on deception, that really changes how you go about doing it, right?
Mm.
Mhm,
You
100%.
just have to be smart about it. Once you see other people use very effective tools, hey, maybe we do that too, and maybe we get similar results. And you see this in sports too, right? You see how, basketball, I guess Steph Curry, the shooting, the three-pointers, huge change in the way the league is, in the way the sport is. You see someone who could develop a shot like that and make it so effective, make it so dangerous. You have other people who say, hey, maybe I could do that at a very high level as well if I'd put in the work. And some of them did. And ultimately, the league changed so much because you're not just going to start doing that randomly unless you have kind of the knowledge of that it's going to be useful, it's going to be beneficial, right?
Mhm.
And some people develop that themselves through work and whatnot and just innovation, sure. But ultimately, a lot of times you're not going to be the one who comes up with a lot of these things. Most people don't. No matter what field it is, what aspect of life it is, a lot of time it is looking at these different stories, looking at history, seeing these different things and the effect of them, that you start to think to yourself, okay, you know what, maybe they're onto something. Maybe I try this out. Like when we talk about diet, so we talk about how, a lot of time is kind of learning about it and then trying it out for yourself and see how you kind of, how it works for you, right? What the effects of that diet have on your body, on your life, with your lifestyle. And I think a lot of times when you do certain things like that, what ends up happening is you adjust, right? You kind of learn through the process. And then that's when you get to a point that you find the most effective, the most beneficial way of doing things for you. And even perhaps develop a newer, more nuanced way, a version of that particular thing, right?
Yeah. I think humans naturally just want to adapt and progress. Just being curious in general. I think that's when knowledge is really taken to the extremes. You could say, well, what is power though? Like, is power like leverage over someone else, or like is power maybe like it's motivational power, right? To motivate someone, like let's say to go to the gym, or to change their life, or turn things around, or it's physical power, right? I think knowledge leads to all different types of power or leverages, and advancements. I think I had a point somewhere. I was thinking about it, and then classic, I forgot. I guess I lost some power.
Oh man.
Yeah. I don't know. I just think it's a very interesting concept to think about. It's very hard to conceptualize, like what the power could be. But yeah, like you guys were saying, like just tactics, in old wars, like deception and stuff. Once you acknowledge that, once you have the knowledge of that, you're like, okay, we'll do that. But then once, the enemy
Mm-hmm.
has the knowledge of that, then it starts, becoming more like chess, where it's like, all right, how do I counteract
Yeah.
that? Then it's just, although they don't know it, like they're helping each other, like in the future.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, it's kind of weird, but I think knowledge brings people together. I think it.
They can.
Yeah, I think it can really help people connect with one another. Especially sharing knowledge. I think people generally appreciate that. When you learn something, and like maybe it's not all knowledge, or maybe it's not all the things you learn, but maybe some things you take more interest into. You appreciate that more, and then you would tend to spread that, be like, like, hey, like this, and someone else, they have that now, and what do they do with it, right? And it goes back to communicating. I don't know. I had a point, but somewhere along the way I lost it.
It's all good.
It's all good.
Some people say that ignorance is bliss, right? And the point I'm kind of making is kind of saying the opposite of that, almost, about kind of the benefits of knowledge. So like Lorenzo, like you know the kind of how in many ways the meat industry is unethical, and other problems that exist there, right? And because you have that knowledge, you decide that you want to make a change in the way you do things, right?
Yeah.
So that kind of power to
I feel like it's an
enact
interesting
change,
point,
right?
though. Yeah, the meat industry one, I feel like that's an interesting one, though. I feel a lot of my decision to actively not buy meat and try to avoid it as much as I possibly can. Because I feel like most people have an implicit kind of understanding at this point. Everyone's seen the videos of the poor animals getting abused, in those factory farms, with just completely unnecessary suffering, right? It's like, yeah, you can eat the cow, but like, you really have to make it suffer so much before you eat the cow, I feel like that's an interesting point, because I feel like a lot of people are quite aware of that. And it's not that they don't care. I feel like it's just, at this point, society's conditioned them to be okay with it, It makes it's so easy to go out of your way and just buy like a regular beef patty. You don't even think about it, You don't have that kind of like connection there, When you go and buy the sausage or whatever, it's kind of like it's not cognitive dissonance, but there's this disconnect from you buying the products or whatever and supporting the meat industry to your understanding of how unethical the meat industry is.
Yeah.
So I would say a lot of people don't really understand, the extent of it. They don't really think about it. They maybe, just kind of hear a little about it. Oh, it's unethical, right? Oh, they suffer.
Yeah.
But they don't really understand what exactly is going on. They don't necessarily think about it that much, right?
With social media, surely people must have come across a video or two, right? Because it pops up every now and then, right? You see, like, the videos of the factory farms. Like at least once every 6 months, I'm sure one of those videos pops up. We see like the terrible conditions, from like a little post here and there. And I suppose it's possible that somebody would just never get that on their feed ever.
No, I'm just saying, like, people consume a lot. People consume a lot. And one video in 6 months about that in passing isn't necessarily what actually allows them to develop a deep enough understanding for them to actually think about it enough to necessarily do anything.
Well, I suppose what I'm trying to get to is that what got me to kind of change it up and decide to go a little bit less, or I guess maybe a bit more meat agnostic. It wasn't some revelation about the meat industry that I didn't know before.
Okay.
You know what I mean? Like, there wasn't any new knowledge about the meat industry that immediately precipitated that. It was just sort of a realization, like, oh my God, I've compromised my moral integrity for the sake of convenience for so long, And I think a lot of that is facilitated by the meat industry through advertising and whatnot. I suppose that might have been something that I hadn't internalized before, you know, in the same way that I did when I changed up my behaviors. So I think that's what I'm trying to get at. Like, the knowledge was definitely a prerequisite to that happening, for sure.
Okay.
I just think that a lot of people have that prerequisite knowledge and aren't acting on it, because not many people, like, I feel like, George, you're kind of like an anomaly. I would say you're a rather rational person, you know.
Okay.
But the majority of people act much more irrationally than they might think. They're not nearly as consistent in their thinking and then in their behaviors people like to think. And I think that would be a perfect example. You're one person who, if you had that information and you had that sort of like cognitive kind of recognition, like, oh, this probably isn't a good thing, you know, maybe I shouldn't be doing this, right? You would probably follow through with it quite easily, right? You could probably at least give it a fair shot. Yeah. A lot of people, depending on the circumstances, might not go through with that, you know. I mean, I feel like the meat industry is the perfect example. Or the chocolate industry. Chocolate's not so good. That's a little bit trickier. Because I feel like information there is definitely a little bit more lackluster. It's not nearly as in your face as the animal advocates are.
I just think like what Lorenzo said, I think majority of people know, or, you know, a large amount of people know about the meat industry and like all the things that go on there. I also don't think it's not like that they don't care. It's just because it's so easy. It's so like it's so easy to just go and, you know, you're hungry, buy a steak, right? You're used to that. It's more like a habit thing. You know, like if you were taught and like
it's been normalized,
if you were raised for, you know, like however long to eat meat, like why stop, right? Why stop if it doesn't really affect you in any way? Maybe like you feel guilty, but not guilty enough to change your whole eating habits, right? So I just think people at the end of the day, they care more about like, you know, like what they've been taught or like how they've been raised and, you know, how they live, rather than, you know, like how the animal is. Although they think it's immoral, they're not going to do much about it because maybe they're like, well, what impact does that make, right? How does that actually, like, what does me not eating meat or buying, you know, meat from or things from certain industries have an impact? Like, how does that actually help? They don't really like, you know, they kind of like below themselves and the amount of impact it can have. And I think that's why a lot of people don't really.
It's kind of a defeatist kind of argument, you know. It's like
man.
That was one thing that I had always told myself for the longest time, and that was kind of a change in my mindset when I decided to stop supporting the meat industry, and I decided basically almost to go vegetarian. Every now and then I'll eat some meat.
Nice.
Cows are real cute, but they're not. But I go out of my way to like avoid buying fast food unless it's like a Beyond Meat burger or something like that. But that was that's kind of like one way to justify your meat eating. You know what I mean? I think the more I think about it, I think cognitive dissonance is a really good way to fit it. We just learned about cognitive dissonance in my psych course, and cognitive dissonance is kind of like this. It's this tension you get when your actions don't match or when your behaviors are in incongruence with your beliefs, I suppose. So what you end up having is either a justification of your actions, context of your beliefs, or a change in your beliefs. One of the two, right? Either you justify the action or that you change the belief, right? And with the meat industry example, you know, there's a sort of cognitive dissonance because you get this tension, you know that it's immoral to buy meat, but you end up in a way, right? Like, and that's a very subjective statement. You might genuinely believe that it's perfectly moral to buy meat, and that's fine. A lot of people are amoralists. They don't even think there's such things as morals at all. But even though you think, okay, supporting the meat industry is bad, right? You still support the meat industry. You justify the action by saying, oh, it's whatever. It doesn't make a difference, right? It might not be a satisfactory justification from a logical perspective, but it still resolves the tension, and then you're just fine. You get to go.
It's just enough.
You get to eat
right?
meat. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So that's big. And then you talked about it. It's just so normalized. The meat industry's gone ham. They've controlled the information.
Got ham.
They've controlled the information. And they go out. I mean, think about it, man. They go out of their way to really not censor, but a lot of the animal activism. Which, to be fair, I kind of understand from a legal perspective. If they're filming inside the factories and whatnot, it makes sense. But big meat has a big hand in trying to suppress that information. If the activists had their way, they'd be even more out there than they already are.
Well, you see this type of suppression information all the time. I mean, in the beginning, like when it comes to like cigarettes and whatnot, they didn't have the information, but it wasn't like that long when they figured it out, right? And there was like quite a decent period of time when there were, pretty solid studies already conducted, and that information wasn't really getting out there to the masses, largely because of the suppression by the industry, and because they wanted to continue to advertise to basically everyone and whatnot. And a lot of people, without knowing how bad smoking really is for you, they wouldn't make that change. But when they do understand it, like you said, it isn't necessarily what caused them to change, but it's a prerequisite a lot of the times. It's one of the factors that is needed, and like that is important, and that having that knowledge gives you the power to make a more informed decision.
It's the most
right?
basic prerequisite. Yeah. That reminds me, because nowadays it's coming out. There's a lot going on, I think, in this field quite recently over the last couple of months. But we've had this knowledge for a while as well. But a lot of these oil industries have known for 40 plus years the impacts of fossil fuels on climate change, and they've done a lot to keep that information from disseminating, or they've downplayed it so much. And it's been insane because they've known, like, they have articles nowadays or documents that they're finding from like the 40s where it's like, yo, you guys legit knew at the highest level how bad this was 40 plus years ago, and y'all didn't do shit about it, bro. What the fuck?
Yeah.
And that's just another.
See, with chemical companies as well, especially when it comes to stuff from the agriculture. Right, they know how some of this stuff, like the effect they will have and whatnot, but they just keep selling it, man. Who cares? They'll just become even more reliant on our products, even better for us. Who cares, man? It's like, bruh.
They control the knowledge, man. They had all the power.
Yeah. And
then they're just super powerful. Big oil, super powerful. It's more powerful now than it was back then. Even with the rise of, or even with the, I guess, developments in reliable energy, we're still so dependent on fossil fuels. I don't know why Europe doesn't go crazier with renewables, man. If you look at how dependent they are on Russia, I'd be terrified. I'd be scared shitless if I were them, bro.
Hey, man.
Like,
we said this before, I think, crazy. But like, gotta go nuclear, man.
Yes, sir. Nuclear.
It's 100%. True. And it's the best solution, like literally. It's oh my goodness, it's so much better than any other solution.
They should have been doing this, man.
They should have, honestly.
Yeah,
I can't believe we have energy crisis in the world nowadays because of these things.
So stupid, man. And why don't people do nuclear? Bro? I don't get it, man. Like, I'm pretty sure the modern reactors that they've designed, they literally could not have a catastrophic meltdown. Like, people are scared.
Even the accidents they had before is mostly due to poor management and more like corruption in the building process, right? What's it called? Just taking money and whatnot, just cutting
corners.
Cutting corners, yeah, exactly. It's all because of those. Like, none of them is really because like the thing was designed poorly, right?
Yeah, no.
then all the modern ones is like, even if it's managed poorly, like it's kind of designed in a way where like nothing could go terribly wrong.
Yeah, they've added so
Like,
many layers of redundancy at this point. It's not even funny. Like, I think that,
and also people realize like
Yeah.
how poor management in these things could be so serious, and people are like, governments especially are just so much more kind of scrutinizing them, right? So in so many ways, like all of these things just seem like they would be avoided, and the benefits, like the energy, how much energy you could get out of it, how efficient those stuff are, and how clean compared to like a fossil fuel they are. Like, there's no better solution at this point. Like any of the other renewable energy sources, it doesn't do nearly as much as nuclear. No. Like there's just no way.
And with the drawbacks too, because pretty much every renewable energy source, other than maybe like geothermal, has like some massive caveats. Like the wind. Well, what if there's just no wind? But like solar. Like oh man, I watched this video yesterday, and it's like just this tiny pit. Well, not tiny. It's a couple 100,000 square kilometers of the Sahara Desert, which comparatively with how big the Sahara Desert is, it's literally a speck, right? That's a very small portion of the Sahara Desert, but just that tiny little bit could power all of Europe with solar. The difficulty is you can't really transport that much energy overseas right now, and the infrastructure
you can't.
It would just be absolutely ridiculous. You got no shot of transporting.
And it's also very difficult to build large-scale stuff in the Sahara.
Yeah, that's
so like a lot of those ideas is just very difficult. Well, honestly, I feel like if everyone really understood the benefits of nuclear and the limited drawbacks it has compared to other methods, I feel like maybe there would be change,
I mean,
if that knowledge is actually, widespread, instead of people being so afraid of it. Because, you're afraid of what you don't understand, and you don't even necessarily have to understand certain things very well, but you just, they're pretty reputable sources, and people who really do understand it, and articles kind of showing, kind of breaking it down, why it's safe and why it isn't, in detail the design, and even like the history of it if you want to look into it. But there's a lot of important things that you're able to understand even without a high level education, and those are out there. And if that is actually really widespread, perhaps there would be change. But honestly, man, it takes a long time for those things to build. So the longer you kind of wait, the more it's like, bro, come on.
That's one of the things that makes you think, maybe Socrates wasn't so bad in his critique of democracy, because I feel like the only reason why nuclear didn't get developed, I'm sure there's a lot of factors, but a big part of it was probably some very successful fear-mongering on the part of, I'm assuming the oil industry probably had a hand in this too, but...
They have a hand in so many weird things.
Like, I'm
Sometimes
assuming
you don't
they
even
probably instilled quite a bit of fear in consumers, and just the general misunderstanding of radiation, Like... the posts, man.
Everything is radiation, man. Like,
oh my god,
like, bro.
Like, Jesus Christ, man. Some people are so dense, bro. Like, I love the post that the post where like they'll mention like H2O instead of water. You're like, oh, what the fuck is that?
They describe it, and then they say, bro, how is this allowed? Bang it.
Yeah. Exactly, right? The same thing with the radiation, where it's like, here's like a portable radiation emitting. It's a flashlight. It's literally a flashlight or something like that.
I remember, like, we're looking at the actual kind of official hazard kind of information about this. I think it was citric acid or something, but right? It's citric acid is in lemon, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, that is.
Yeah, exactly. So then we're gonna look at it, and then like, you know, we weren't told what it was. We weren't told what it was in. We're just looking at the information, and then the professor asked, like, "Do you think this is safe to consume?" And then a lot of people are just like, "Nah, this that's dangerous, man." Did you see what they're saying? It's like, bro, you have to look at what concentration it is. You have to look at the amount, and there's just a lot that goes into it. So when people just describe all these things to you, like, no, you got share more, you know, you can't misinform people like that. You know, you can't just give limited information like that. There needs to be a more complete kind of access, or not even just access, but depiction of the situation, right? So when they want to describe water or flashlights like that, like, that's clearly misleading, and that's clearly building a narrative, right?
Yeah.
And that's not
Well,
free access to proper knowledge.
I feel like the water and flashlight informations, or a lot of those examples, are definitely
memes, right?
Not even just memes. They're kind of like poking fun at
satire.
They're satire. Yeah. Kind of highlighting that sort of ignorance, and people will be very uncritical of the information they get. You know, people will get information and be,
goodness, critical thinking nowadays.
It's rather lacking. A lot of people just take it face value. And it's important at pretty much every level of knowledge. You know, like even when you're reading university articles, it's important. I feel. I think it's very important. If you're reading that kind of stuff, to know something about research methods and proper kind of like procedure when you're doing that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
Because otherwise, there's a lot of studies out there that can't be replicated very well at all. There's kind of a replication crisis going on in a lot of the sciences, where it's like, we can't actually replicate a lot of this stuff, man. What's going on? So even if some of the studies that scientists, you know, are quite confident in are having troubles being replicated, imagine some of the weaker studies that aren't in like the top-notch journals that people will be very quick to cite, that it fits their narrative, right?
Exactly.
So, man,
can't just cherry pick.
Knowledge is power, man, and like control of knowledge is crazy powerful. Yeah. Makes you think, man. Makes you think.
It does make you
think. We got to
think,
do an episode on democracy, man. We have to.
We do, and we also have to do a episode on lotocracy.
Which you know about that? No, I don't know about that one.
It's the one where they select a random person to be the leader. So it could be either one of us.
That'd be nuts. That'd be interesting.
And obviously there are many different ways to do that, and the different ways of splitting up the power and whatnot. But the whole idea is that, like, a lot of people who want power. I forget who said the quote, but something about, you know, great leaders don't want that position, right? And
that makes sense.
You gotta question someone that actually wants to be in that position, right?
Yeah, like a lot of politicians.
That's kind of the idea, exactly.
I mean, last 5-6 years have been very demonstrative of that. Like, Jesus Christ,
globally too. Like a lot of the people all around the world say, "Hey, yo, they were elected."
Yeah, like what the fuck?
The majority of people decided that was the person.
That was the best person. And it's always the people who are. I mean. Makes sense, because the people who end up winning most of the time are the people who play the political game the best, you know? They end up appealing to, say, them right. Like, for example, right, in Brazil and all those areas.
I was just thinking that.
Brazil, that's a classic example, other than maybe Trump. But the Trump one gets a little bit murky, because there are some, I think, there are some things his administration did that wasn't entirely all bad for America. I don't think for a second Trump came up with it, but Brazil's a very good example, because it's almost like a cult over there. He's such a shitty president, Bolsonaro over there, and yet there are so many people in more disadvantaged positions
Mhm.
who would pretty much suck his dick if he came up to him. Like, it's insane. Like, the cult personality he's built up.
Diehard.
Diehard fans, and he is garbage tier if they knew anything about him. But they love everything about him, man. It's insane. He's got him whooped. He's got him whooped. And that's his voting base, I guess. Yeah, that's bananas.
Yeah. Yeah, but definitely we gotta talk about democracy and also other forms of governments, because those are definitely very interesting and very, I guess, relevant, both historically and even looking at it now, because there's so many different styles of government even today, and even within the same style of government, there's like, you know, different kind of nuances and difference in nuances. You know, how in U.S. is kind of like the two-party system, where in Canada there's only two parties that could actually win, but there are more that actually get seats and get some form of power and make things a bit more interesting.
Yeah, it changes.
And then obviously like the first past the post system, there's like the parliamentary system, and there's obviously like the different roles monarchy plays, and there are just so many different forms of governments and whatnot, and those are all very interesting to talk about for sure. And I definitely think when you said that Socrates was onto something about democracy, I definitely agree. I definitely agree. The sentiment, at least, because overall, I wouldn't say I'm a fan of democracy. I would say that I like it more than other systems.
That's for sure.
But I don't necessarily like the system itself. It's more of a relative thing. And yeah, I guess the last thing is, let's finish this episode off with the highlights of the week. Lorenzo, go ahead.
Sally Limon. Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
With you. Yes, sir. Good seeing you again.
That was good.
That's fun.
And Dia de Morto, you know. Didn't even know.
Close.
Morte?
Yes, sir. Close.
Yes, sir.
Is that how you
My
say
bad.
it in Italian?
I was thinking, no.
French?
No, it's not.
No, definitely not.
No. Yeah.
Some. Yeah, probably.
Yeah. I think it's either morte or morti, depending on if it's feminine or masculine plural. If I say I am dead, I would say, you know, morto. Yeah.
Okay, I see. That makes sense.
Yeah. So, but Days of the Dead is 2 days, right?
Is it?
That's first and second,
I don't know.
I think.
I heard.
Isn't it first and second of November?
I forget. I don't know. I haven't looked into the date. I don't know anything about that holiday, to be honest. I just know that people love to celebrate it worldwide for some reason. Very strange.
But yeah, it was a delicious lunch. Good time, and didn't even realize we went on that day for literally one of the biggest Mexican holidays at a Mexican restaurant.
Yeah, it's so funny.
Pretty good. Yeah. What about you, Raymond?
Not much. Just chilling. Just
yo, season 11. The Apex, yes sir.
Well, fair enough. Doing it all, I'll say that my highlight is being back here. My reading week. Went to Shahriyar's house. We've had Shahriyar on as a guest, and I have also linked his YouTube channel as friends of the show. So if you want to check him out, he is linked to this channel. Had a fun time at his place. Was a really good host, by the way. Made some delicious food, and also had store-bought food that was really good with cheese and salami, and he bought bread from the bakery. He baked cookies, but the actual food he made himself, very nice. Very nice.
Oh my god, dude.
Would recommend.
Dude, he made this Japanese curry the last time I was over. Oh my god, dude, I'm not over it. That's still the highlight of my year, dude. That's so good.
No, bro.
Oh my god.
I don't know. He did. I heard about that.
Dude.
But I do actually make Japanese curry pretty much every week.
You have no idea.
I just use the store-bought the cubes, the Japanese curry cubes, the one they actually use in Japan. Very classic. We should also do kind of more of a history on food, just because it's very interesting to see kind of how some of these food originated, because a lot of time they go from place to place to place, very much influence, and a lot of time you don't even realize it. One example is like how Japanese tempura is
Portuguese.
kind of what it is, Portuguese, right?
Crazy.
You see interesting stuff like that, and you also see a lot of just very nuanced things about, like, in Italy there's so many different styles of pasta, right? And like literally, like if you actually go out and look at each place, they'll have many different style of their own, like from their own region, and there's just so many different interesting things about it. But other highlight, going for food with you, that was definitely really nice. Going to Indigo afterwards was also very nice. Had a nice day out with my parents on Monday. So yeah, been back here. A lot of things have just been pretty nice. Do have to get a lot of work done still, and that part isn't necessarily as nice, but it's good getting some stuff done and understanding more about some of the assignments and material I'm studying.
That's good.
Pretty good overall. Just enjoying my reading week as a whole.
I can't overstate how good that curry was, man. We gotta get the recipe from it, man. And I'm not over it. There's months ago, I'm still thinking about it daily. So
nice. Well, on that note, that's gonna be it from us this week, and we thank you for listening.
Thank you.